They told you it was your duty. They painted a picture of heroism, of sacrifice, and of a nation's gratitude waiting for you on the other side. They asked you to lend them your life's savings, not just as a transaction, but as a testament to your loyalty. What they conveniently left out was that this patriotic investment was designed from the very beginning to be a one-way street. This wasn't about funding a war, it was about funding an illusion. And in this grand performance, the average citizen was cast in the role of the willing victim, bankrolling what would become the most successful financial deception in modern history, a trick so powerful it's still being played on you today. The year is 1914, and the world is on fire. The great empires of Europe, drunk on pride and ambition, have stumbled into a conflict of unimaginable scale. The First World War was not a war of gentlemen and cavalry charges. It was a brutal, industrial meat grinder. It ran on steel, oil, and endless mountains of explosives. And very quickly, the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany stared into their national treasuries and saw nothing but dust. The gold reserves that backed their mighty empires were vanishing, spent on artillery shells and machine guns. They were facing a catastrophic choice: either raise taxes to crippling levels and risk a full-blown revolution at home, or find another way. They had to find a way to make people want to hand over their money. The solution they landed on was both diabolical and brilliant. They decided to stop selling debt and start selling emotion. This wasn't just about raising capital, it was about rewriting the relationship between the citizen and the state. In Britain, the campaign was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Posters plastered on every street corner didn't show interest rates or bond yields. They showed grieving mothers, solemn soldiers, and the accusing eyes of children. The message was brutally simple. If you couldn't hold a rifle, you had to open your wallet. To refuse wasn't a financial decision, it was an act of treason. In Germany, they were called Kriegsanleihen, or war loans, and citizens eagerly lined up, believing their investment was a direct contribution to victory. But it was in America where the scheme was perfected into a dazzling spectacle. When the US entered the war in 1917, the government unleashed an emotional blitzkrieg. They called them Liberty Bonds, and the biggest names in the country were enlisted to sell them. Charlie Chaplin, the most famous man in the world, produced and starred in a film titled The Bond, effectively a commercial for the Treasury. Movie stars held rallies, baseball players pitched bonds from the diamond, and even the Boy Scouts went door to door. It was a cultural phenomenon, a national obsession. You weren't just buying a piece of paper, you were buying a piece of the glory, but what no one was told was that the paper itself was designed to lose. Beneath all the patriotic fanfare and celebrity endorsements lay a devastatingly simple trick. The Liberty Bonds were essentially an IOU from the government, a promise to pay you back your initial investment, plus a little interest after the war was won. The posters promised a hero's return on your money. But the real enemy of the bondholder wasn't on the battlefield. It was hiding in the government's own printing presses. To fund the astronomical costs of the war, the US government, like all the other warring nations, was creating money out of thin air. This massive influx of new currency inevitably led to one thing: rampant inflation. Between 1917 and 1920, the cost of living in the United States nearly doubled. So when a proud patriot went to cash in their $100 bond, they received exactly $100. The problem was that $100 could now only buy what $50 could have bought just a few years earlier. They got their money back, but half of its purchasing power had vanished into thin air. It was a theft, but a legal one, hidden in plain sight behind the complex machinery of economics. And what happened next would expose the true cynicism of the entire operation. The same story played out with even more brutal consequences across Europe. In Britain, the government's 1917 war loan paid a seemingly generous 5% interest. But by the early 1920s, post-war inflation had erased nearly 60% of the bond's real value. The loyal subjects who had lent their savings to the crown were left holding a near worthless asset. In Germany, the situation escalated into a full-blown nightmare. The government had financed its entire war effort by printing marks and selling war loans. When the war was lost, the German economy collapsed into a black hole of hyperinflation. The currency became so worthless that people used wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Those patriotic citizens who had poured their life savings into war bonds saw their wealth completely annihilated. They had invested in victory and received total financial ruin in return. They weren't just victims of a lost war. They were victims of a deliberate and calculated financial strategy. The governments knew inflation was the inevitable consequence of their actions. They knew the bonds they were selling were a promise they couldn't truly keep. The war bonds were never meant to be a good investment for the people. Their purpose was to transfer wealth from the public to the state, using patriotism as the perfect cover story. The scam wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the narrative, and when the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world's governments found themselves in an impossible position. They were sitting on a mountain of debt owed to their own citizens, the very people they had just sent to fight and die for them. Default was not an option. Admitting that the patriotic sacrifice had been a terrible financial deal would have triggered mass outrage. So they devised a second, even more subtle trick. Instead of repaying the debt, they simply changed its form. In Britain, the government took the short-term war loans and converted them into long-term securities called consols. These were perpetual bonds, meaning they would pay a small amount of interest forever, but would never actually be paid back in full. It was a genius way to turn a temporary wartime emergency into a permanent burden on the public. For decades, families and veterans received their tiny interest payments, a constant reminder of their patriotic duty, while the real value of their original investment had long since been eaten away by inflation. In fact, Britain only finished paying off the last of its World War I debt in 2015, nearly a century after the war ended. The war was over, but the payments never stopped, becoming a ghost in the national financial machine. But the legacy of this deception ran far deeper than just one country's balance sheet. In America, the Liberty bonds were quietly absorbed into the growing machinery of the US Treasury, laying the foundation for what we now know as the national debt. What started as an extreme measure for an extreme time became the standard operating procedure for government finance. The world had learned a powerful and dangerous lesson. As long as you could wrap borrowing in the flag of a noble cause, you could borrow endlessly. The psychological barrier had been broken, and when the Second World War erupted just 2 decades later, the playbook was already written. This time, the bond drives were even more polished, more pervasive, and more effective. The US War Bond Office became a Hollywood production studio, enlisting A-list stars like Rita Hayworth, Bette Davis, and Clark Gable. Walt Disney created propaganda cartoons where characters like Donald Duck and Bugs Bunny urged children to buy war-saving stamps. The message was inescapable, woven into the very fabric of popular culture. Once again, Americans lined up in droves, pouring billions into the war effort. And once again, post-war inflation silently chipped away at their returns. But this time, nobody seemed to notice or care. The habit of lending to the government had become a conditioned reflex. The financial scam of World War I had become the patriotic instinct of World War II. And the consequences would reshape the entire globe. The end of World War II saw the rise of a new kind of empire. The United States emerged not just as a military superpower, but as the world's undisputed financial hegemon. The US dollar, backed by the credibility of the US Treasury market, a market born directly from those early Liberty bonds, replaced gold as the foundation of the global economy. Foreign governments, central banks, and major corporations all began to hold US debt as their primary reserve asset. The wartime propaganda tool had become the bedrock of international finance. The entire modern economic system, from your pension fund to your home mortgage, is built upon the very same principle pioneered in 1917, unwavering faith in government debt. And ever since, whenever a crisis strikes, the same pattern repeats itself with chilling predictability. During the Cold War, it was buy savings bonds to fight communism. After 9/11, it was buy treasury bonds to defend freedom. During the 2008 financial crisis and the recent pandemic, governments unleashed trillions in stimulus, funded by massive borrowing, all sold to the public as a necessary act to save the system. The enemy changes, but the mechanism remains identical. It always starts with an appeal to emotion, fear, security, unity, and it always ends with more debt on the national ledger, a debt whose value is quietly eroded over time. The true genius of the war bond scam was never about financing a single conflict. It was about fundamentally rewiring our concept of money and trust. Before 1914, people primarily trusted tangible assets, gold, land, and their own savings. The war bond campaigns taught generations to place their faith in a government's promise. They blurred the line between saving and obedience so effectively that questioning the debt became synonymous with questioning the nation itself. That psychological shift is the true legacy we live with today. We no longer see ourselves just as citizens, we have been trained to see ourselves as stakeholders, and even collateral in the national enterprise. The war never ended, it just changed its name. Now it's a war on poverty, a war on terror, a war on climate change, or a war on the latest economic recession. Each new crisis becomes the justification for another round of borrowing, sold to us as a moral imperative. Instead of posters of soldiers, we get economists on television explaining why this time the debt is different. But the underlying transaction is the same. You lend your future prosperity to solve a present-day problem, and the silent tax of inflation ensures you never get the full value back. The original deception has been institutionalized, and now it runs on autopilot, the unquestioned foundation of our world. The war bond never disappeared. It just learned to wear a suit and tie, and we call it economic policy.